Welcome back, Danny fans. We're up to chapter 19, and I think we're about to finish the book. So thank you for staying with me, and away we go. Rockabye Baby. At 8:30 the next morning, my father went into the workshop and dialed Doc Spencer's number on the telephone. Now listen, Doctor, he said, if you could be here at the filling station in about half an hour, I think I might have a little surprise present for you. The doctor said something in reply. My father replaced the receiver. At 9 o'clock, Doc Spencer arrived in his car. My father went over to him, and the two of them held a whispered conversation beside the pumps. Suddenly, the tiny doctor clapped his hands together and sprang up into the air, hooting with laughter. You don't mean it, he cried. It's not possible. He then rushed over to me and grasped my hand in his. I do congratulate you, my dear boy, he cried, pumping my hand up and down and doing so fiercely it nearly came off. What a triumph, what a miracle, what a victory. Now, why on earth didn't I think of that method myself? You are a genius, sir. Hail to thee, dear Danny. You're the champion of the world. Here she comes, my father called out, pointing down the road. Here she comes, doctor. Here who comes, the doctor said. Mrs. Clipstone. He spoke the name proudly, as though he were a commanding... He spoke the name proudly, as though he were a commander, referring to his bravest officer. The three of them stood together beside the pumps, looking down the road. Can't you see her? My father asked. Far away in the distance, I could just make out a small figure advancing towards us. What's she pushing, Dad? My father gave me a sly look. There's only one way of delivering pheasants safely, he said. And that's under a baby. Isn't that right, Doc? Under a baby, Doc Spencer said. Of course, in a pram with the baby on top. Fantastic, the doctor said. My old dad thought that one up many, many years ago, my father said, and it's never been known to fail yet. It's brilliant, Doc Spencer said. Only a brilliant mind could think of something like that. He was a brilliant man, my father said. Can you see her now, Doctor? And that'll be young Christopher Clipstone sitting up in the pram. He's 1.5, a lovely child. I delivered him, Doc Spencer said. He weighed 8 pounds 3 ounces. I could just make out the small dot of a baby sitting high up in the pram, which had its hood folded down. There's more than 100 pheasants under that little nipper, my father said happily. Just imagine it. You can't put 100 pheasants in a child's perambulator, Doc Spencer said. Don't be ridiculous. You can if it's been specially made for the job, my father said. This one is built extra long and extra wide, and it's got an extra deep well underneath. Listen, you could push a cow around in that if you wanted to, let alone 100 pheasants and a baby. Did you make it yourself, Dad? I asked. More or less, Danny. You remember when I walked you to school and then went off to buy the raisins? Well, the day before yesterday, I said. Yes. Well, and after that, I went straight up to the vicarage and converted their pram into this special extra large poacher's model. It's a beauty, really is. You wait till you see it. And Mrs. Clipstone says it pushes even easier than an ordinary one. She did a practice circuit with it in her backyard as soon as I'd finished it. Fantastic, the doctor said, and again, absolutely fantastic. Normally, my father went on, an ordinary bought pram is all you'd ever need. But then no one's ever had over 100 pheasants to deliver before. Where does the baby sit? The doctor asked. On top, of course, my father said. All you need is a sheet to cover them, and the baby sits on the sheet. A bunch of pheasants makes a nice soft mattress for any child. I don't doubt it, the father said. We'll be having a very comfortable ride today. We stood beside the pumps, waiting for Mrs. Clipstone to arrive. It was the 1st of October, and one of those warm, windless autumn mornings with a darkening sky and the smell of thunder in the air. What was so marvellous about my father, I thought, was the way he always surprised you. It was impossible to be with him for long without being surprised and astonished by one thing or another. He was like a conjurer bringing things out of a hat, and right now it was the pram and the baby. In a few minutes it would be something else again. I felt sure of that. Right through the village, as bold as brass, my father said. Good for her. She seems in an awful hurry, Dad, I said. She's sort of half running. Don't you think she's sort of half running, Doc Spencer? I imagine she's just a little bit anxious to unload her cargo, the doctor said. My father squinted down the road at the approaching figure. She does appear to be going a bit quick, doesn't she? She's going very quick, I said. There was a pause. My father was beginning to stare hard at the lady in the distance. Perhaps she doesn't want to be caught in the rain, he said. I'll bet that's exactly what it is. She thinks it's going to rain and she doesn't want the baby to get wet. She could put up the hood, I said. He didn't answer this. She's running, Doc Spencer cried. Look, it was true. Mrs. Clipstone had suddenly broken into a full sprint. My father stood very still, staring at her, and in the silence that followed, I fancied I could hear a baby screaming. What's up, Dad? He didn't reply. There's something wrong with that baby, Doc Spencer said. Listen. And at this point, Mrs. Clipstone was about 200 yards away from us, but closing fast. Can you hear him now, Dad? Yes, I can hear him. He's yelling his head off, Doc Spencer said. The small, shrill voice in the distance was growing louder every second, frantic, piercing, non-stop. He's having a fit, my father said. It's a good thing we've got a doctor handy. Doc Spencer didn't say anything. That's why she's running, Doctor, my father said. He's having some sort of issue, and she wants to get him here quick, and perhaps put some cold water on him. Some noise, I said. If it isn't a fit, my father said, you can bet your life it's something like it. I doubt it's a fit, the doctor said. My father shifted his feet uneasily on the gravel of the driveway. There's 1,001 different things keep happening every day to little babies like that, he said. That's right, isn't it, Doctor? Of course, Dr. Spencer said, every day. I knew a baby once who caught his fingers in the spokes of a pram wheel, my father said. Cut 'em clean off. The doctor smiled. Whatever is it, my father said. I wish to heaven she'd stop running. It would give the game away. A long lorry loaded with bricks came up behind the pram, and the driver slowed down and poked his head out of the window to stare. Mrs. Clipstone ignored him and flew on. She was so close now I could see her big red face with the mouth wide open, panting for breath. I noticed she was wearing white gloves on her hands, very prim and dainty. There was a funny little white hat to match, perched right on top of her head, like a mushroom. Suddenly, out of the pram, straight up into the air, flew an enormous pheasant. My father let out a cry of horror. The fool in the lorry began roaring with laughter. The pheasant flapped around for a few seconds and lost height and landed on the grass by the side of the road. Crikey, Dr. Spencer said, look at that. A grocer's van came up behind the lorry and began hooting to get by. Mrs. Clipstone kept on running. Then whoosh, a second pheasant flew up out of the pram. Then a third and a fourth. Great Scott, Dr. Spencer said. I know what's happening. It's the sleeping pills. They're wearing off. My father didn't say a word. Mrs. Clipstone covered the last 50 yards at a tremendous pace. She was swinging into the filling station with birds flying out of the pram in all directions. What on earth is happening? She shrieked. She pulled up sharp against the first pump and seized the screaming infant in her arms and dragged him clear. With the weight of the child suddenly lifted, a great cloud of pheasants rose up out of the gigantic pram. There must have been well over 100 of them, and the whole sky above us in the filling station was filled with huge brown birds clapping their wings. Well, a sleeping pill doesn't last forever, said Doc Spencer, shaking his head sadly. It always wears off by the next morning. The pheasants were too dopey to fly far, and in a few seconds down they came and settled themselves like a swarm of locusts all over the filling station. The place was covered with them. They sat wing to wing along the roof of the workshop, and about a dozen were clinging to the sill of the office. Some had flown down onto the rack that held the bottles of lubricating oil, and others were sliding about on the bonnet of Doc Spencer's car. And one bird with a fine tail was perched superbly on top of a petrol pump, and quite a number, those who were too sleepy to do anything else, simply squatted in the driveway at our feet, fluffing their feathers and blinking their small eyes. My father stayed remarkably calm, but not poor Mrs. Clipstone. They nearly pecked him to pieces, she was crying, clasping the screaming baby to her. Take him to the caravan, Mrs. Clipstone, my father said. All these birds are making him nervous. And Danny, push that pram into the workshop, quick. Mrs. Clipstone disappeared into our caravan with the baby. I pushed the pram into the workshop. Across the road, a line of cars had already started forming behind the brick lorry and the grocer's van. People were opening their doors and getting out, beginning to cross over to stare at the pheasants. Watch out, Dad, I said. Look who's here. Chapter 20. Goodbye, Mr. Hazel. The big, shiny silver Rolls Royce had braked suddenly and come to a stop right alongside the filling station. Behind the wheel, I could see the enormous pink face of Mr. Victor Hazel staring at the pheasants. I could see the mouth hanging open and the eyes bulging out of his head like toadstools, and the skin of his face turning from pink to bright scarlet. The car door opened and out he came, resplendent, in fawn-coloured riding breeches, high polished boots. There was a yellow silk scarf with red dots on it around his neck, and he had a sort of bowler hat on his head. The great shooting party was about to begin, and he was on his way to greet the guests. He left the door of the Rolls open and came at us like a charging bull. My father, Doc Spencer, and I stood close together in a little group, waiting for him. He started shouting at us the moment he got out of the car, and he went on shouting for a long time after that. I'm sure you would like to know what he said, but I can't possibly repeat it. The language he used was terrible. Words came out of his mouth that I'd never heard before. Little white flecks of foam began forming around his lips and running down his chin onto his yellow silk scarf. I glanced at my father. He was standing very still and very calm, waiting for the shouting to finish. The colour was back in his cheeks now, and I could see the tiny twinkles of a smile round the corners of his eyes. Doc Spencer stood beside him, and he was also very calm. He was looking at Mr. Hazel, rather as one would look at a slug on a leaf of lettuce in a salad. I myself did not feel so calm. But they are not your pheasants, my father said at last. They are mine. Don't lie to me, man, yelled Hazel. I'm the only person around here who has pheasants. They are on my land, said my father quietly. They flew onto my land, and so as long as they stay on my land, they belong to me. Don't you know the rules, you silly old man? Doc Spencer started to giggle. Mr. Hazel's skin turned from scarlet to purple. His eyes and his cheeks were bulging so much with rage, it looked as though someone was blowing up his face with a pump. He glared at my father. Then he glared at the dopey pheasants swarming all over the filling station. What's the matter with them? He shouted. What have you done to them? At this point, pedalling grandly towards us on his black bicycle, came the arm of the law in the shape of Sergeant Enoch Samways, resplendent in his blue uniform and shiny silver buttons. It was always a mystery to me how Sergeant Samways could sniff out trouble wherever it was. Let there be a few boys fighting on the pavement or two motorists arguing over a dented bumper, and you could bet your life that the village bobby would be there within a few minutes. We all saw him coming now, and a little hush fell upon the entire company. I imagine the same sort of thing happened when a king or a president enters a room full of chattering people. They all stop talking and stand very still as a mark of respect for a powerful and important person. Sergeant Samways dismounted from his bicycle and threaded his way carefully through the mass of pheasants squatting on the ground. The face behind the big black moustache showed no surprise, no anger, no emotion of any kind. It was calm and neutral, as the face of the law should be. For a full half a minute he allowed his eyes to travel slowly around the filling station, gazing at the mass of pheasants, squatting all over the place. The rest of us, included even Mr. Hazel, waited in silence for judgment to be pronounced. Well, 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 said Sergeant Samways at last, puffing out his chest and addressing everyone in particular. What, may I ask, is happening around here? Sergeant Samways has a funny habit of sometimes putting the letter H in front of words that shouldn't have them. And as though to balance things out, he would take away the H from all the words that should have begun with that letter. I'll tell you what's happening around here, shouted Mr. Hazel, advancing upon the policeman. These are my pheasants, and this is a rogue pointing at my father. He has enticed them out of the woods and onto his filthy little filling station. Enticed? Said Sergeant Samways, looking first at Mr. Hazel and then at us. Enticed them, did you say? Of course he enticed them. Well now, said the sergeant, propping his bicycle carefully up against the pumps. This is a very interesting accusation. Very interesting indeed. Because I ain't never heard of nobody henticing a pheasant across 6 miles of fields and open countryside. How do you think this henticing was performed, Mr. Hazel, if I may ask? Don't ask me how he did it, because I don't know, shouted Mr. Hazel. But he's done it all right. The proof is all around you. All my finest birds are sitting here in this dirty little filling station when they ought to be up in my wood getting ready to be shot. The words poured out of Mr. Hazel's mouth like hot lava from an erupting volcano. Am I correct, Sergeant Samways? Am I absolutely accurate in thinking that today is the day of your great shooting party, Mr. Hazel? That's the whole point, cried Mr. Hazel, stabbing his forefinger into the sergeant's chest as though he were punching a typewriter or an adding machine. And if I don't get those birds back onto my land, quick sharp, some very important people are going to be extremely angry this morning. And one of my guests, I'll have you know, Sergeant, is none other than your boss, the Chief Constable of the county. So you'd better do something about this fast, hadn't you? Unless you want to lose those sergeant stripes of yours. Sergeant Samways did not like people poking their fingers in his chest, least of all Mr. Hazel, and he showed it by twitching his upper lip so violently that his moustache came to life and jumped about like some small bristly animal. Now, just 1 minute, he said to Mr. Hazel. Just 1 minute, please. Am I to understand that you are accusing this gentleman here of committing this act? Of course I am, cried Mr. Hazel. I know he did it. And do you have any evidence to support this accusation? The evidence is all around you, shouted Mr. Hazel. Are you blind or something? Now, my father stepped forward. He took one small pace to the front and fixed Mr. Hazel with his marvellous, bright, twinkling eyes. Surely you know how these pheasants came here, he said softly. Surely I do not know how they came here, snapped Mr. Hazel. Then I shall tell you, my father said, because it is quite simple, really. They all knew they were going to be shot today if they stayed in your wood, so they flew here to wait until the shooting was over. Rubbish, yelled Mr. Hazel. It's not rubbish at all, my father said. They are extremely intelligent birds, pheasants. Isn't that so, Doctor? They are tremendously intelligent, massive brain power, said Doc Spencer. They know exactly what's going on. It would undoubtedly be a great honour, my father said, to be shot by the Chief Constable of the county, and an even greater one to be eaten afterwards by Lord Thistlethwaite, but I do not think a pheasant would see it that way. You are scoundrels, both of you, shouted Mr. Hazel. You are rapscallions of the worst kind. Now then, said Sergeant Samways, insults ain't going to get us nowhere. They only aggravate things. Therefore, gentlemen, I have a suggestion to put to you. I suggest that we all of us make a big effort to drive these birds back over the road onto Mr. Hazel's land. How does that strike you, Mr. Hazel? It'll be a step in the right direction, Mr. Hazel said. Get on with it, then. How about you, Willem? The sergeant said to him. Are you agreeable to this action? I think it's a splendid idea, my father said, giving Sergeant Samways one of his funny looks. I'll be very glad to help. So will Danny. What's he up to now, I wondered, because whenever my father gave someone one of his funny looks, it meant something funny was going to happen. And Sergeant Samways, I noticed, also had quite a sparkle in his usually stern eye. Come on, my lads, he cried. Let's push these lazy birds over the road. And with that he began striding around the filling station, waving his arms at the pheasants and shouting, Shoo, shoo! Off you go, beat it, get out of here. My father and I joined him in a rather absurd exercise, and for the second time that morning clouds of pheasants rose up into the air, clapping their enormous wings. It was then I realised that in order to fly across the roads, the birds would first have to fly over Mr. Hazel's mighty Rolls Royce, which lay right in their path with its door open. Most of the pheasants were too dopey to manage it, so down they came again, smack on top of the silver car. They were all over the roof and bonnet, sliding and slithering and trying to keep their grip on that beautifully polished surface. I could hear sharp claws scraping into the paintwork as they struggled to hang on, and already they were depositing their dirty droppings all over the roof. Get them off, screamed Mr. Hazel. Get them away. Don't you worry, Mr. Hazel, Sergeant Samways cried. We'll fix them for you. Come on, boys. Easy does it. Shoo 'em right over the road. Not on my car, you idiot, Mr. Hazel bellowed, jumping down. Send them the other way. We will, sir, we will, answered Sergeant Samways. In less than a minute, the rolls was literally festooned with pheasants, all scratching and scrambling and making their disgusting runny messes along the shiny silver paint. What is more, I saw at least a dozen of them fly right inside the car, through the open door by the driver's seat. And whether or not Sergeant Samways had cunningly steered them in there himself, I don't know, but it happened so quickly that Mr. Hazel never even noticed. Get those birds off my car, Mr. Hazel bellowed. Can't you see they're ruining the paintwork, you madman? Paintwork? Sergeant Samways says. What paintwork? He had stopped chasing the pheasants now, and he stood there looking at Mr. Hazel and shaking his head sadly from side to side. We've done our very best to encourage these birds over the road, he said, but they're too ignorant to understand. My car, man, shouted Mr. Hazel. Get them away from my car. Ah, the sergeant said. Your car, yes, I see. I see what you mean. Beastly dirty birds, pheasants are. But why don't you just hop in quick and drive away fast? They'll have to get off then, won't they? Mr. Hazel, who seemed only too glad for an excuse to escape from this madhouse, made a dash for the open door of the rolls, leapt into the driver's seat. The moment he was in, Sergeant Samways slammed the door, and suddenly there was the most infernal uproar inside the car as a dozen or more enormous pheasants started squawking and flapping all over the seats and around Mr. Hazel's head. Drive on, Mr. Hazel, sir, shouted Sergeant Samways through the window in the most commanding policeman's voice. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Get going quick. There's no time to lose. Ignore them pheasants, Mr. Hazel, and accelerate that engine. Mr. Hazel didn't have much choice. He had to make a run for it now. He started the engine, and the great rolls shot off down the road with clouds of pheasants rising up from it in all directions. And then an extraordinary thing happened. The pheasants that had flown up off the car stayed up in the air. They didn't come flapping downwards. They stayed up there and kept on flying. And over the top of the filling station they flew, and over the caravan, and over the field at the back, where our little outdoor lavatory stood, and over the next field, and over the crest of the hill, until they had disappeared from sight. Great Scott, Doc Spencer said, just look at that. They've recovered. The sleeping pills have worn off at last. Now all the other pheasants around the place were beginning to come awake. They were standing up tall on their legs and ruffling their feathers and turning their heads quickly from side to side. One or two of them started running about, then all the others started running, and when Sergeant Samways flapped his arms at them, the whole lot took off into the air, flew over the filling station, and were gone. Suddenly, there was not a pheasant left, and it was very interesting to see that none of them had flown across the road or even down the road in the direction of Hazel's Wood, and the great shooting party, every one of them had flown in exactly the opposite direction. Chapter 21. Doc Spencer's Surprise. Out on the main road, a line of about 20 cars and lorries was parked bumper to bumper, and the people were standing about in groups, laughing and talking about the astonishing sight that they had just witnessed. Come along now, Sergeant Samways called, striding towards them. Get going, get moving. We can't have this. You're blocking the highway. Nobody ever disobeyed Sergeant Samways, and soon the people were drifting back into their cars, getting in. And in a few minutes they too were all gone. Only the four of us were left now, Doc Spencer, Sergeant Samways, my father, and me. Well, Willem, Sergeant Samways said, coming back from the road to join us beside the pumps. Them pheasants was the most astonishing sight I've ever seen in my entire life. It was lovely, Doc Spencer said, just lovely. Didn't you enjoy it, Danny? Marvellous, I said. Pity we lost them, my father said. It's very near broke my heart when they all started flying out of the pram. I knew we'd lost them then. But how in heaven's name did you ever catch them in the first place? Asked Sergeant Samways. How did you do it, Willem? Come on, man. Let me into the secret. My father told him. He kept it short, but even then it was made a fine story. And all the way through, Sergeant Samways kept saying, well, I never. Well, I'm blowed. You could knock me down with a feather. Stone the crows and things like that. And when the story was finished, he pointed his long policeman's finger straight at my face and cried, "Well, I'm jiggered. I never would have thought a little nipper like you would have come up with such a fantastical brainwave as that. Young man, I congratulate you." "He'll go a long way, young Danny will. You see if he doesn't," Dr. Spencer said. "He'll be a great inventor one day." To be spoken about like that by the two men I admire most in the world after my father made me blush and stutter. And as I stood there wondering what on earth I was expected to say in reply, a woman's voice behind me cried out, "Well, thank goodness that's all over at last." This, of course, was Mrs. Grace Clipstone, who was now picking away cautiously down the caravan steps with young Christopher in her arms. "Never in my life," she was saying, "have I seen such a shambles as that." The little white hat was still perched on top of her head, and the prim white gloves were still on her hands. "What a gathering," she said, advancing towards us. "What a gathering we have here of rogues and varmints. Good morning, Enoch." And there she is. "Good morning to you, Mrs. Clipstone," Sergeant Samways said. "How's the baby?" my father asked her. "The baby is better, thank you, William," she said, "though I doubt he'll ever be quite the same again." "Of course he will," Dr. Spencer said. "Babies are tough." "I don't care how tough they are," she answered. "How would you like it if you were being taken for a nice walk in your pram on a pretty autumn morning, and you were sitting on a lovely soft mattress, and suddenly the mattress comes alive and starts bouncing you up and down like a stormy sea? And the next thing you know, there is about 100 sharp, curvy beaks poking up from underneath the mattress and pecking you to pieces." The doctor cocked his head over to one side and then to the other, and he smiled at Mrs. Clipstone. "You think it's funny," she cried. "Well, just you wait, Dr. Spencer, and one night I'll put a few snakes or crocodiles or something under your mattress and see how you like it." Sergeant Samways was fetching his bicycle from beside the pumps. "Well, ladies and gents," he said, "I must be off and see who else is getting into mischief around here." "I am truly sorry you were troubled, Enoch," my father said. "Thanks very much indeed for your help." "I wouldn't have missed this one for all the tea in China," Sergeant Samways said. "But it did sadden me most terrible, Willem, to see all those lovely birds go slipping right through your fingers like that, because to my mind there don't exist a more luscious dish than roasted pheasant anywhere on this earth." "It's going to sadden the vicar a lot more than it saddens you," said Mrs. Clipstone. "That's all he's been talking about ever since he got out of bed this morning, the lovely roast pheasant he was going to have for his dinner tonight." "He'll get over it," Dr. Spencer said. "He will not get over it, and it's a rotten shame," Mrs. Clipstone said, "because now all I've got to give him are some awful frozen fillets of cod, and he never liked cod anyway." "But," my father said, "surely you didn't load all those pheasants into the pram, did you? You were meant to keep at least a dozen for you and the vicar." "Oh, I know that," she wailed, "but I was so tickled at the thought of strolling calmly through the village with Christopher sitting on top of 120 birds, I simply forgot to take back for ourselves, and now alas they're all gone. And so is the vicar's supper." The doctor went over to Mrs. Clipstone and took her by the arm. "You come with me, Grace," he said. "I've got something to show you." He led her across to my father's workshop, where the big door stood wide open. The rest of us stayed there and waited. "Good grief, come and look at this," Mrs. Clipstone called from inside the workshop. "William, Enoch, Danny, come and look." We hurried over to the entrance of the workshop. It was a great sight. Laid out on my father's bench amid the spanners and wrenches and oily rags were 6 magnificent pheasants. "There we are, ladies and gentlemen," said the doctor, his small wrinkled face beaming with delight. "How's that?" We were speechless. "2 for you, Grace, to keep the vicar in a good mood," Dr. Spencer said. "2 for Enoch for all the fine work he did this morning, and 2 for William and Danny, who deserve them most of all." "What about you, Doc?" my father asked. "That doesn't leave any for you." "My wife has enough to do without plucking pheasants all day long," he said. "And anyway, who got them out of the woods in the first place? You and Danny." "But how on earth did you get them?" my father asked. "When did you nab them?" "I didn't nab them," the doctor said. "I had a hunch. What sort of hunch? My father asked. It seemed fairly obvious, the doctor said, that some of those pheasants must have gobbled up more than one raisin each. Some, if they were quick enough, might have swallowed half a dozen each, or even more, in which case they would have received a very heavy overdose of sleeping pills and would never wake up. Aha, we cried, of course, of course. So while you were all busy driving the birds onto old Hazel's Rolls Royce, I sneaked in here and had a look under the sheet in the bottom of the pram, and there they were. Amazing, said Sergeant Samways. Absolutely amazing. Those were the greedy ones, the doctor said. It never pays to eat more than your fair share. Marvellous, my father said. Well done, sir. Oh, you lovely man, cried Mrs. Clipstone, flinging an arm around the tiny doctor and giving him a kiss on the cheek. Now, come along, the doctor said to her. I'll drive you home. You can leave this crazy perambulator here. And Enoch, we'll take your birds with us and drop them off at your house on the way. We can't have the arm of the law cycling through the village with a brace of pheasants slung over his handlebars. I am very much obliged to you, doctors, Sergeant Samways said. I really am. My father and I loaded 4 of the pheasants into the doctor's car. Mrs. Clipstone got into the front seat with the baby, and the doctor sat himself behind the wheel. Don't be sad, William, he said to my father through the window as he drove off. It was a famous victory. Then Sergeant Samways mounted his bicycle and waved us goodbye and pedalled away down the road in the direction of the village. He pedalled slowly, and there was a certain majesty in the way he held himself, with his head held high and his back very straight, as though he were riding a fine thoroughbred mare instead of an old black bike. Chapter 22. My Father. It was all over now. My father and I stood alone just outside the workshop. Suddenly the old place seemed to become very quiet. Well, Danny, my father said, looking at me with those twinkly eyes, that's that. It was fun, Dad. I know it was, he said. I really loved it, I said. So did I, Danny. He placed one hand on my shoulder, and we began walking slowly towards the caravan. Maybe we should lock the pumps and take a holiday for the rest of the day, he said. You mean not open up at all? Why should we, he said. After all, it's Saturday, isn't it? But we always stay open on Saturdays, Dad, and Sundays. Maybe it's time we didn't, he said. We could do something else instead, something more interesting. I waited, wondering what was coming next. When we reached the caravan, my father climbed the steps and sat down on the little platform outside. He allowed both his legs, the one in plaster and the good one, to dangle over the edge. I climbed up and sat down beside him with my feet on the step of the ladder. It was a fine place to sit, the platform of the caravan. It was such a quiet, comfortable place to sit and talk and do nothing in pleasant weather. People with houses have a front porch or a terrace instead, with big chairs to lounge in, but I wouldn't have traded it either for those old wooden platforms. I know a place about 3 miles away, my father says, over Cobbler's Hill, down the other side, where there's a small wood of larch trees. It's a very quiet place and the stream runs right through it. The stream, I added. He nodded and gave me another little twinkly look. It's full of trout. Oh, could we? I cried. Could we go there, Dad? Why not, he said. We could try tickling them, the way Doc Spencer told us. Will you teach me, I said. I haven't had much practice with trout, he told me. Pheasants are more in my line, but you could always learn. Can we go now, I asked, getting excited all over again. I thought we would just pop into the village first and buy the electric oven, he said. You haven't forgotten about the electric oven, have you? But, Dad, I said, that was when we thought we were going to roast lots and lots of pheasants. We've still got the 2 Doc gave us, he said. And with any luck, we'll have lots more of them as the weeks go by. It's time we had an oven. Anyway, when we can roast things properly instead of heating up baked beans in a saucepan, we could have roasted lamb on one day, beef on another. Yes, I said, of course I would. And Dad would be able to make you my favourite thing of all. What's that, he asked. Toad in the hole, I said. By golly, he cried. That'll be the very first thing we'll make in our new oven, toad in the hole. I'll make it in an enormous pan, the same way as my old mum used to, with Yorkshire puddings, very crisp, and risen up in huge bubbly mountains and lovely sausages nestling in between the mountains. Can we get it today, Dad? Will they deliver it at once? They might, Danny. We'll have to see. Could we order it now on the telephone? We mustn't do that, my father said. We must go personally to see Mr. Wheeler, and we must inspect all the different models with great care. All right, I said, let's go. I was really steamed up now about getting an oven and being able to have toad in the hole and roast dinners. I couldn't wait. My father got to his feet, and when we've done that, he said, we'll go off to the stream and see if we can't find ourselves some big rainbow trout. We could take sandwiches with us for lunch and eat them beside the stream. That sounds like a great day. A few minutes later, the two of us were walking down the well-trodden road towards the village to buy the oven. My father's iron foot went clink, clink on the hard surface, and overhead some big black thunderclouds were moving slowly down the valley. Dad, I said. Yes, my love? When we have our roasted pheasant supper with our new oven, do you think we could invite Doc Spencer and Mrs. Spencer to eat with us? Great heavens, my father cried. What a wonderful thought. What a beautiful idea. We'll give a dinner party in their honour. The only thing is, I said, will there be enough room in the caravan for 4 people? I think so, he said, just. But we'll have to get 2 more chairs. That's no problem, Danny. You and I can sit on the boxes. There was a short silence. Then he said, but I'll tell you what we must have, and that is a tablecloth. We can't serve dinner to the doctor and his wife without a tablecloth. But we don't have a tablecloth, Dad. Don't you worry about it, my father said. We can use a sheet from one of the bunks. That's all a tablecloth is, a sort of sheet. What about knives and forks, I said. How many do we have? Just 2 knives, I said. 2 forks. And those are all a bit dented. We shall have to buy 2 more of each, my father said. We shall give our guests the new ones, and we shall use the old ones ourselves. Good, I said. Lovely. I reached out and slid my hand into his. He folded his long fingers around my fist and held it tight. And we walked on towards the village, where soon the 2 of us would be inspecting all the different ovens with great care and talking to Mr. Wheeler personally about them. And after that, we would walk home again and make up some sandwiches for our lunch. And after that, we would set off with the sandwiches in our pockets, go striding over Cobbler's Hill and down the other side to the small wood of larch trees with a stream running through it. And after that, perhaps a big rainbow trout. And after that, there would be something else after that. And after that, yes, something else again. Because what I'm trying to tell you, what I've been trying so hard to tell you all along, is simply that my father, without the slightest doubt, was the most marvellous and exciting father any boy ever had. And that's the end of Danny the Champion of the World. I hope you've enjoyed it. Perhaps you'd like to read some more of Roald Dahl's books. Take care now.